The night the barn burned, I was sitting on my porch watching the stars, a cold beer sweating in my hand, and my boots kicked up on the railing. The smell hit me first burnt wood, sharp and unnatural then. The orange glow lit up the dark horizon like a second sunrise. My barn, the one I'd built with my father's hands and my own sweat 20 years ago, was already half engulfed in flames by the time I grabbed my keys and raced across the field. The wind howled through the dry grass as if it were mocking me, carrying the crackle of fire and the distant sound of sirens. But I already knew. I didn't need a fire marshal to tell me what happened. I'd told the HOA no. And this was their answer. It started 3 months earlier, when the Homeowners Association, led by a woman named Janet Carson, though most around here called her HOA Karen, began nosing around my ranch. The official excuse was community development. They claimed the unused land at the edge of my property was ideal for a new community centre extension which just so happened to include a paved road through my north pasture and a paved walking trail that would slice straight through my cattle grazing area. I told them no, politely at first, firmly the second time. Then I got the letters: zoning review, public access revision, voluntary land donation request. I threw each one in the trash. You see, my land's been in the family for 3 generations. My grandfather carved fence posts by hand. My mother gave birth to me in the ranch house across the field. I wasn't just guarding a property, Lenai was protecting a legacy. And Janet? She wasn't interested in heritage. She wanted HOA expansion, and she wanted control. When intimidation didn't work, she sent inspectors. I found one taking photos behind my barn, another poking around my tool shed without permission. I filed complaints. No one responded. So when the fire marshal ruled the barn blaze undetermined but suspicious, I knew what he meant. He just couldn't say it out loud. But I could. And I would. I spent that entire night at the edge of the flames, hose in hand, fighting alongside the volunteer fire crew to keep the fire from spreading to the dry grass that led straight to the house. They managed to contain it, but the barn was gone. The roof collapsed before sunrise, leaving behind a smouldering carcass of charred beams and twisted metal. I stood there in the grey dawn, staring at what used to be my feed storage, my workbench, my late father's tools. All of it, ash. My eyes burned not just from smoke but from rage. The fire marshal offered his condolences. No signs of electrical failure, no lightning in the area. No one saw anything, he said. But I did. I saw intent.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
He said. But I did. I saw intent. I saw a message. Janet Carson hadn't just wanted my land, she wanted to make an example out of me. This was a warning to every other property owner who might say no. But she miscalculated. Because I don't scare easy. And I don't forget. The next morning, I made some calls. Quiet ones. Friends in trucking. A cousin who worked in construction. A buddy who owed me a favor from back in the army. I asked them all the same question. You know anyone with cement trucks and no HOA contract? By the end of the day, I had 9 trucks on standby. I ordered the 10th myself. But before revenge, there had to be proof. I knew burning down a barn was a crime. I also knew Janet wasn't stupid enough to leave evidence behind. But what she didn't count on was the trail she left while trying to cover her tracks. I started digging. I hacked into my own outdoor camera network one she didn't know about because it was disguised as a wildlife tracker. And there it was. Just after midnight the night before the fire, 2 men in hoodies parked near the service road behind my land. One carried a gas can. The other? A flare. And the truck they used? Belonged to a landscaping company that just happened to have an exclusive contract with the HOA. I printed the screenshots, time-stamped and labelled. I filed a report. But I didn't wait around for justice. justice would be poured. While the county sheriff opened an investigation that would likely move slower than molasses, I was already sketching out my next move on the back of an old feed invoice. I didn't want just an apology. I didn't want compensation. I wanted something she'd never forget, something that would bury her arrogance in stone. And that's when it hit me. The HOA's prized jewel wasn't their clubhouse, or their paved trails, or even their holiday events. It was the community pool, Olympicized, HOA-funded, centrally located, and built directly behind Janet's house so she could oversee safety, which really meant controlling access and parading her power around like royalty. She had it cleaned twice a week, reserved weekend parties for board members only, and once fined a child's family $500 for splashing too much. I drove by the next morning. The gate was open. A line of clean white concrete trucks would look awfully poetic parked out front. But I needed the perfect day. I needed the board distracted. So I waited. 3 days later, the HOA held their quarterly planning retreat in the next county over a mandatory vision weekend that Janet always led personally. The pool would be empty, the clubhouse vacant. I gave the signal. At 10:04 a.m., 10 cement trucks rolled up to the HOA property in perfect sync, like a convoy of Judgment Day angels. The drivers followed the blueprints I handed them, carefully reversing, aligning chutes, aiming directly into the deep end. One by one, the grey slurry flowed out like punishment in liquid form. Thick. Unstoppable. Final. Within minutes, the shallow end was a swamp of hardening mix. By the time the 4th truck finished, the diving board disappeared beneath the rising tide. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I stood at the fence, arms crossed, cowboy hat low, and watched their precious HOA symbol become a cement tomb. By the time Janet returned, we were gone. The trucks had rolled out. The gates were closed. And the concrete? Already setting. She screamed. Neighbors gathered. And me? I just smiled. Because now we were even. But I wasn't finished. By sunset.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
We were even. But I wasn't finished. By sunset, photos of the filled pool had already gone viral on the local community app. Someone captured Janet standing beside the concrete pit, red-faced, pointing like a furious dictator at nothing. The caption read, "HOA gets cemented." Another resident added a meme of a rubber duck frozen in concrete, with the words, "Rip HOA fun." But I wasn't laughing. Not really. Because I knew what was coming. Janet wasn't just angry. She was cornered. She called an emergency meeting of the board. They tried to claim criminal destruction of community property, but the land records I held proved something different. The pool wasn't technically HOA property. It sat on a plot the HOA rented from a development trust I had quietly bought into last year, when they were selling partial interest. My lawyer submitted the proof. The HOA hadn't paid the last 3 months' rent. The lease had defaulted. Technically, the pool was mine when I buried it. Janet lost her mind. She tried to file a lawsuit. Claimed I trespassed. Claimed I endangered residents. Claimed I violated the community spirit. But the only thing I violated was her unchecked power. I filed a countersuit. Arson suspicion, trespassing, property interference, and abuse of HOA authority. I had video, witnesses, financials. And I had her voice on tape from a board meeting whispering, "If he won't cooperate, we'll make it happen the hard way." That recording alone made 3 board members resign immediately. As the legal filings mounted, I watched the community shift. People who were once silent began questioning every fine, every permit rejection, every special assessment fee. Janet had ruled by fear for too long. And now that fear turned on her, parents who never complained about HOA party rules pulled their kids from swim lessons. Retirees who always paid dues on time started asking for audits. Her power dissolved not with a bang, but with 1,000 little cuts. And in the middle of it all, I rebuilt my barn. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted Janet to see it every time she drove past the field and realized her fire hadn't destroyed me. It had forged me. The new structure was bigger, stronger, fireproofed with steel siding and a concrete foundation. On the front gable, I placed a sign in black iron letters, "This land bends for no one." That was the end of the first battle. But I knew Janet wouldn't stop. Her pride was wounded, her power slipping, and desperate people make stupid moves. So, I waited. Ready. Because if they came for my land again, I wouldn't bring 10 trucks. I'd bring 20. It didn't take long for the aftermath to hit. The concrete hadn't just filled their pool, it flooded their entire power structure. The HOA board went into chaos mode. Janet, humiliated and furious, tried to present it as a hate crime against the community, as if I had desecrated some sacred temple instead of burying an overpriced splash hole. She tried to turn the neighborhood against me with emergency newsletters and emotional pleas. "He's dangerous," she wrote. "He poured concrete where our children swim." But the truth was already out there. I hadn't touched a public pool. I'd buried her private monument to control, and I did it using her own lease agreement. Still, Janet didn't give up. She called a vote to reassert HOA control over bordering properties. She tried to pass an emergency amendment that would allow the board to review disruptive land use near community amenities. It failed. 2 board members walked out during the vote. One of them looked me dead in the eye at the next general meeting and said, "Whatever you're doing, keep going. She's finished." The best part? That meeting was held under a pop-up tent. The clubhouse pool deck was no longer usable now, a crater of hardening cement, with weeds already sprouting around the edges. They couldn't even drain it. The county inspector labelled the entire area as hazardous surface and recommended demolition. The HOA didn't have the funds to fix it. Janet refused to call a vote to raise dues. She was trying to save face, but all she was doing was accelerating her own collapse. And collapse it did. I didn't have to file another lawsuit. I didn't have to speak at another hearing. The evidence was speaking for me now. An anonymous whistleblower leaked HOA financial documents, internal emails, budget reports, special project requests, all pointing to misuse of funds. Thousands in phantom repairs. Board retreats booked at luxury lodges. Land maintenance charges that had no vendor names attached. One entry simply read, "Community Relations Consulting $4, $750. It was a cover-up payment. Everyone could see it. Suddenly, the sheriff's department wasn't just investigating my barn fire. They were looking into Janet's entire tenure. And that's when she made her final mistake. Janet's final mistake wasn't a quiet retreat. It was a full-blown, ego-fueled power grab. Backed into a corner, with lawsuits pending and neighbors abandoning her leadership like a sinking ship, she did what desperate tyrants always do. She lashed out. She forged a new emergency policy and delivered it to every mailbox in the neighborhood, declaring a mandatory HOA restructuring fee of $2,000 per household. She claimed it was necessary to restore community integrity and rebuild essential services, but the truth was clearer than concrete. She was broke, angry, and out of moves. Residents revolted. Some laughed. Some raged. A few even camped out on the pool deck with lawn chairs and popcorn, treating the cement-filled pool as performance art. Someone painted freedom.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Cement-filled pool as performance art. Someone painted Freedom Pond on the side of the concrete. Another neighbor, one of the quiet ones, installed a flagpole right next to it and hoisted the American flag above it. When Janet tried to fine him for the flagpole, the man sued her personally. That's when she snapped completely. She showed up on my land. I was out in a pasture fixing the fence when I saw her SUV crawl up my driveway like a wounded animal. She got out in heels, a red pantsuit, and eyes like firestorms. Before I could speak, she started yelling. "You ruined everything! Do you even know what you've done? That pool was a symbol!" I just looked at her and said, "Yeah, and now it's a monument. You think this is over? You think you win because you poured some cement and played cowboy?" I leaned on the fence post, wiped my brow, and said, "No, Janet. I win because I never had to lie." She stormed off, tires spinning, and that was the last time she stepped on my land. 3 days later, she was arrested. The county prosecutor filed charges for fraud, misappropriation of community funds, falsifying HOA documents, and obstruction of investigation. Local news called the footage of her being escorted out of her home in handcuffs. Her mugshot hit social media within minutes. The headline read, "HOA Queen cemented in scandal." Once Janet was behind bars, everything unraveled fast. The interim HOA board, appointed by court order, announced a full audit of all operations from the past 5 years. Residents were allowed to submit claims for reimbursement. And I submitted one for the full value of my barn, including every tool lost, every bale of hay, every charred memory. The board approved it unanimously. In fact, they added a public apology printed in the HOA newsletter, stating that a grievous abuse of power led to the destruction of Mr. Dalton's private property, and that the board fully supports his right to defend what was his. Funny how fast apologies come when the Queen falls. The community changed overnight. The iron grip that had ruled over mailbox colours and garden gnomes was gone. Flags popped up in yards. Patios were built without blueprints. People smiled again. For the first time in years, the neighbourhood felt like a place people chose to live in, not one they were trapped inside of. The pool was never reopened. The concrete stayed. Weeds grew tall around the deep end, and birds nested in cracks where chlorine used to burn. Eventually, someone painted a mural on the surface. A wide, bold eagle with its wings stretched, clutching broken chains in each talon. Beneath it, in black block letters, someone wrote, "Not HOA property." They asked me once if I'd do it all again. I looked across my rebuilt barn, at the cattle grazing in the sun, at the peace that had returned to my land, and I said, "I didn't start the fire, but I sure as hell poured the last load." And I meant it. Because sometimes, revenge isn't loud. Sometimes, it sets quietly. Like concrete. Hard. Permanent. And impossible to ignore. The morning the last HOA sign came down, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. Calm. The kind of calm that only comes after a long, bitter storm finally passes. The board had voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. After the arrests, the lawsuits, the public embarrassment, the community simply gave up on governing each other. The clubhouse was sold. The newsletter stopped. The website shut down. What remained were neighbours, not residents. People who had lived side by side under a flag of regulation were now learning to wave to each other again without fear. I walked the property line that day not to inspect or guard it, but to remember. The barn, now rebuilt with fireproof siding and lined with thick cedar beams, stood strong against the wind. The scent of fresh lumber still lingered when the breeze rolled through. It wasn't just a building. It was a promise. This land would not bow. Not to flames. Not to signatures. Not to power.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Flames. Not to signatures. Not to power. And yet, something inside me couldn't settle. I hadn't heard anything from Janet in over 5 months. Her trial ended with a plea deal, 5 years in prison, full restitution, and a permanent ban from managing or participating in any registered homeowner organization in the state. The press moved on. The sheriff stopped calling. And I thought that was the end. But then I got the letter. No stamp. No return address. Just my name, scribbled in shaky handwriting and sealed in a plain white envelope. I almost threw it away. But something told me to open it. Inside was a single piece of paper. You think you won. But I didn't burn your barn. I just watched it happen. That's all it said. And just like that, the calm cracked. The letter turned in my hand for hours. I studied every inch of it. No fingerprint. No smudge. Just that haunting line. I just watched it happen. That changed everything. If Janet hadn't ordered the barn fire, then who had? And why did she take the fall in silence? I dug back into the surveillance footage I'd saved re-watching the two hooded figures approaching the barn. I'd always assumed it was a hired hit from Janet, but now I noticed something strange. One of them had a limp. A heavy one. Left foot dragging slightly, boot scuffed on the outer edge. That detail triggered a memory. A landscaper who used to show up at HOA meetings, always in Janet's shadow. Quiet. Rarely spoke. Drove the same truck used that night. Once fined for parking on a dirt shoulder. Always walked with a limp. His name? Dale Harker. Janet didn't order the fire. Dale lit it, hoping to scare me out, maybe thinking he was doing her a favor. Or worse, trying to frame her to take over the HOA himself. Either way, she knew. She covered for him. Probably to protect the HOA's image. Or maybe herself. I took the letter to the sheriff. They reopened the case. Dale was questioned. And within a week, he confessed not out of guilt, but frustration. Said he was tired of the board being weak, and that I was asking for it. His charges were added on top of the growing list of corruption cases still unraveling from the HOA's past. But now I knew the truth. The fire wasn't just revenge. It was chaos, growing under the surface long before I said no. And Janet? She didn't start the fire. But she let it burn. Her silence had cost her everything, not because she was guilty, but because she allowed power to blind her to the monsters it attracted. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just a story about revenge. It was a story about protection of land, of legacy, of boundaries not just physical, but moral. 1 year later, I hosted the first Neighbors' Day on my ranch. No HOA. No board. Just open gates, music, kids playing in the pasture, and a pig roast beside the rebuilt barn. The same barn that once smouldered, now echoed with laughter, country music, and stories swapped over sweet tea. Someone asked if I'd ever sell the land. I smiled and shook my head. "This place doesn't belong to me," I said. "It belongs to the fight that built it." At sunset, I walked down to the edge of the concrete-filled pool still there, still dry, still cracking. Someone had left a sign sticking out of the cement with one final message: "Here lies control." Died screaming. And I didn't say a word. I just tipped my hat, turned, and walked back to the land that remembered everything.